This lesson is going to cover the domain and range of graphs. Let's look at some examples and notes to help you understand how to find the domain and range of a given graph. The domain of a graph is the width of the picture, using the x-axis to determine the numbers. And I will show you what I mean by this in just a moment. When you write your answer will be written with a smaller number from the x-axis on the left, followed by a less than or equal to sign, the x, another less than or equal to sign, and then the larger number, which tells you that the domain, if this were the x-axis, falls between whatever number is here, which would be your smaller number, and the number here. On the other hand, the range of the graph is the height of the picture, which would be the vertical axis or the y-axis. The answers will be written in the same way as the domain, except for instead of having an x, you will have a y between the less than or equal to signs. In this first example, you see the circle, and what you want to do is draw a box around your graph. Then look at your x-axis or your horizontal axis, and the boundaries of that box will determine the domain or the width of the graph. So in this particular graph, the smaller number or left side of the box is at -2. To the right, we see +2. So that represents our domain. When we write our domain, we will write, again, the smaller number first, less than or equal to sign. We'll use an x for the domain, another less than or equal to sign, and then a 2. What that tells us is that all of our x values for every point on this circle is between -2 and +2. For our range, we will focus on the vertical axis, which would be the height of the circle. So the lowest part of the circle would be at -2 on the y-axis, and the highest part would be at +2. So it will look very similar to the domain, except we will use a y rather than an x to show our range. To determine if it's a function or not, we will go back to using the vertical line test like we learned in the last lesson. So at this point, we will simply draw a vertical line through the circle, and if it touches twice, which it does, we know that this is not a function, because it tells us, if it touches it twice, that our x values are repeating. In example 2, we have the graph of a line. Once again, I would recommend drawing a box around the picture of the graph. Then you can start with the horizontal axis, or x, to determine the domain. If you put a point on both sides of the box, those are the boundaries for the domain. So in this case, our smaller number, or the number to the left, is -1, and to the right is a +1. So when we write our domain, it will be -1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to +1, showing that all of our x values for that particular line are between or equal to the values of -1 and 1. The range, on the other hand, would be at the bottom at -1 and the top at +1. So again, the only difference for this particular problem, for the range, is that we would use a value of y. Whether or not it's a function determines on the vertical line test. So again, I'm going to go ahead and erase this so you can see that line. And if we draw a vertical line, it's only touching it at one spot. So yes, this one is a function because it only touches it once, telling us that no x values repeat. In problem 3, again, we will start by drawing a box around our graph. In this particular graph, if we focus in on the domain, you can see on the left, we're at -2 on the x-axis, and on the right, we're at +2. So we will write our domain as -2 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to positive 2. For the range, however, we are at positive 1 at the top, and we are at negative 3 at the bottom. So again, remember to write your smaller number first, then your less than or equal to sign, using the y for range, and then is less than or equal to 1. Then to determine if it's a function or not, we're going to erase this, draw a vertical line, and again in this case, it touches it twice, which tells us the x values are repeating. So this is not an example of a function. In the last example, we will again draw a box around our graph. And then in this case, if we look at what the boundaries are, the horizontal boundaries or our domain, it would be at negative 3 and positive 3. So we would write our answer or our domain as negative 3 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to positive 3. For our range would be between negative 2 and negative 1. So again, write the smaller number first, less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to negative 1. To determine if it's a function, again, I will erase that information. So you can see when I draw the vertical line, it's only touching the graph at one spot, which tells us that yes, it is a function because the x values do not repeat.